Fantastic. So good afternoon to everybody who's here in Washington, D.C. with us, and everybody who is watching this around the world. I'm Chris Chivas, and I direct the American Statecraft Program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I'm truly delighted to open this special event featuring Senator Chris Van Hollen and Carnegie's president, Tino Cuéllar, who will be talking about the future of U.S.-China policy. Now, this event is timed with the release of a new in-depth volume that we've been hard at work on over the course of the last year and a half that investigates whether or not the U.S. can coexist with China and still defend its vital interests. And I'm in the volume, which we released online this morning, by the way, and I have a copy of it here for anybody who wants to see. If you're here in Washington, I think we actually have some copies available for you to take home. We sketch out what this kind of coexistence might look like a decade from now, and I'm very pleased that several of the experts who contributed to the volume will be joining me here on stage for a panel discussion immediately following this headline event. But first, it is a sincere honor to introduce our special guest, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Van Hollen is U.S. Senator for the state of Maryland. He was first elected to the Senate in 2016 and re-elected for a second term in 2022. He's a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, where he also serves as chairman of the Subcommittee on East Asia, the Pacific, and International Cybersecurity Policy. In this capacity, the senator focuses on policy matters concerning U.S. relations with the countries of East Asia and the Pacific, as well as regional intergovernmental organizations such as the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, and the Pacific Islands Forum. Additionally, Senator Van Hollen is a member of the State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee, on which he works to strengthen investment in the United States' global leadership and competitiveness. He's going to be having discussion with Carnegie's president, Mariano-Florentino, or Tino Cuéllar, as we know him. Tino is the 10th president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This is an institution that was created by Andrew Carnegie in 1910 to advise policymakers, support diplomacy, and conduct independent research on international cooperation, conflict, and governance. Tino is a former justice of the Supreme Court of California. He served 3 U.S. presidential administrations at the White House and in federal agencies, and was also the Stanley Morrison Professor at Stanford University, where he held appointments in law, political science, and international affairs, while at the same time leading the university's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Tino currently serves on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board and the U.S. Department of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board, and chairs the board of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. I am so thrilled that you have both agreed to do this and look forward to your conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome, Senator Van Hollen. It's a pleasure to have you here. Senator, I thought Chris was also going to add that you have quite an unusual background. I would say among U.S. senators that I know, you're the only one who was born in Pakistan, and you might be one of the few who comes from a real diplomatic family. Your father was ambassador of the U.S. to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Your mother was an analyst for the CIA and received awards from the CIA. I wonder if we might start with a little bit of a reflection on how you, as a senator from Maryland, might also be influenced by this unusual background that has brought you to this point.
Well, first of all, Tino, it's great to be with you, and thank you for your leadership here at Carnegie.
Thank you.
You're right. It probably is not your typical background. My father was from Baltimore originally. He grew up in Baltimore. Then he went into the Navy. He met my mom, who back in the day was over at the forerunner to the CIA. She was the daughter of an English teacher who became a Russian language expert and Russian expert. So they met up, and the rest is history. My father was in the Foreign Service, so we grew up many of my early years overseas. You're right, born in Karachi, lived in India, went to 2 years of high school in India, Sri Lanka and Turkey, coming back to the United States in between, just like many military families. So that experience does inform a good part of my outlook. It also led me to team up with Dan Sullivan, who's a Republican senator from Alaska, who had some background in I think the Bush White House, and we formed something called the Foreign Service Caucus, which is dedicated to trying to make sure that we address a lot of the needs of foreign service families, just as we work to address needs of military families.
So a major topic of discussion all over the U.S., really, among people who follow foreign affairs and also just generally follow what is important to the U.S., is how the U.S. will navigate this moment in history in its own relationship with China. And you think about this quite a bit, given the subcommittee you chair, your role in the Senate. I know you've been clear about the importance of having the U.S. deal with the risk and threat China may sometimes pose, but also have suggested that the U.S. shouldn't just go full Cold War. So say a little bit more about how you expect and hope policymakers will strike that balance, what you think will give us an indication of whether we're striking the right balance or whether we're not.
Well, first, let me commend you and Carnegie for doing this study. I look forward to reading the whole thing, but as you well know, we can't see the future, but we can help shape it. And I think it makes a lot of sense to look at different possible future scenarios between the United States and China, look at worst case scenarios and best case scenarios, and try to move things through policy toward the better case scenario. So look, I'm clear-eyed about the challenge we face from China, especially under President Xi. President Xi has been much more aggressive as a leader of China. At the same time, I don't think China is like a 500-pound gorilla that we cannot deal with. I am of the view that we can manage the competition in a smart way. By the way, I was glad to see the two pandas come back to the Washington Zoo, back to little panda diplomacy. But we'll talk about it, but we do have big security challenges with China, both with respect to Taiwan, South China Sea, of course, their support for Putin's war against Ukraine, and big economic challenges. But I do believe there will be a way to navigate these in a way, hopefully, to avoid all-out conflict, because that would serve nobody's interests.
So let's play that out a little bit. We'll get to all these specific topics that you referred to, but as we think about what you would imagine to be the most productive kind of relationship with China 5 years from now, let's say, what are some of the issues on which you think it might be plausible for the U.S. and China to cooperate? And where do you see some of the tensions that we'd still be dealing with at that point?
Well, the areas of cooperation are easy to identify, at least some of them, harder to implement. But clearly we have a mutual interest in avoiding miscalculation. So having military-to-military relationships, not just a hotline when there's a real problem, but on an ongoing basis. And we've made improvements on that since the President President Biden met with President Xi last November at the APEC conference. We've had more of that. Clearly, climate change. We all have an interest in trying to address the climate crisis. And there are also economic opportunities for the United States going forward. Pandemics, we have a mutual interest in planning ahead to be able to deal with pandemics. Fentanyl is something that has really hit a lot of American families. We've made, I think, some progress on getting China to curb these precursor chemicals, but we have a long way to go. AI, trying to put guardrails around AI. So these are things to identify. Putting these areas of cooperation into practice in the midst of all the other things going on, both from a security perspective and the economic competition, is another story. But I do think we should try to carve out some space for that.
Let's turn to the economic picture. It is a fact of our world right now that even after rising tensions between the U.S. and China, there's a degree of interdependence between the Chinese and the American economy. Exports come here. They're critical for the Chinese economy even now. We'll have a discussion about the technology piece in a second. As you think about the strategic economic picture and how both countries benefit from some degree of trade, but they also are actively thinking about diversifying supply chains, reducing dependence on each other. Where's the responsible, thoughtful U.S. policymaker to go? How do we balance all that?
You know, the first thing I should say is we should always make sure we're doing what we can to strengthen the U.S. here at home. Our economy, we would want to do that even if there was not a China on the world scene, but it's especially important that we do that when you have this kind of global economic competition. So I have been a big supporter of the initiatives that we implemented in Congress with the Biden-Harris administration. Everything from the CHIPS and Science Act. We funded the CHIPS part. We really need to fully fund the science part. That R&D is important. The Inflation Reduction Act to really move forward in a clean energy economy. The infrastructure bill. So I do think first and foremost, before we talk about how we deal with exports of technology to China and those sorts of things, we first and foremost need to address critical issues here at home, including our education system. So that's my first cut. With respect to the next steps, I do think it's important to diversify our supply chains in key areas, right? Critical minerals, electric batteries. We don't want to become dependent here in America or among our allies on China, which for a long time, as you know, has cornered the sort of the minerals market and the processing market. We don't want to become dependent, obviously, on high-end chips. So I am in favor of the de-risking approach, not the decoupling approach. I don't think decoupling is realistic or in our interests. So that's my view generally in terms of how we approach this. Be strong at home and also make sure we de-risk when it comes to critical supply chains.
But crucially, if we frame it as de-risking, that means you're still contemplating a future, maybe you feel America should, where there's quite a bit of economic exchange. And I guess the good thing about a nuanced answer is it's nuanced. The challenging thing is that among the people who are watching this, you'll probably imagine some people will say, well, there wasn't a strong enough statement about the fact that any economic interdependence between the U.S. and China is a real risk for the U.S. There might be others who say, well, maybe one could speak more forcefully about the value of even greater trade because that'll reduce risk of conflict and so on. Just say a bit more about what you'd say to these critics who just think America needs kind of a corner solution to be sort of all in on reestablishing deeper economic links to China, and then perhaps many others who might say that you haven't gone far enough.
Sure. Well, first on the continuing economic engagement with China in areas that are not critical to our strategic economic interests. Agriculture exports. Obviously, the United States benefits greatly from agricultural exports to China. So, and we import, things that are not necessarily strategic items where we would have to diversify that supply chain. So I do believe that making sure that space in terms of economic activity does not get disrupted is in our mutual interests. And that is why, when you put huge tariffs on everything, as one presidential candidate is proposing, you're really going to just punish the American people in terms of greater costs on lots of day-to-day goods. So in terms of making sure that we carve out this space for things like electric vehicles and batteries, I think that is an important enough of an industry that we want to make sure that we protect it in the sense of not being reliant on China, where one day they could just say, we're not going to supply any more electric vehicles. We should have our own electric vehicle market. So in the chips area, especially in the high technology areas, where we, at least for now, have an edge in many areas, it seems to me we should make sure that we maintain that edge.
Since you reminded us that there is a presidential election looming, let me ask you about another branch of government, of course, which is one you know well, in Congress. And the kind of discussion you and I are having right now about security, we'll talk about security more in a moment, but about U.S.-China relations more generally, about the economic piece, about how that ultimately affects the welfare and well-being of Americans, are discussions that one would hope and imagine from a civics perspective would be playing out thoughtfully in Congress. As you know, Americans have often quite critical views of Congress. You have an inside perspective. You've accomplished quite a bit there. Say a bit about how productive you think Congress has been, beginning with this issue of China and calibrating the right relationship between the U.S. and China.
Well, you're asking a lot when it comes to thoughtful conversations sometimes in Congress. But I would say that despite most of what you see from the outside, there have been some important, productive, and bipartisan engagements in Congress when it comes to China. When you think about it, our export control laws all go through Congress. We have what's called the CFIUS process for, screening, investments other countries like China make in the United States to make sure that they are in our economic interests and not a way for another country to somehow gain a strategic benefit. When it comes to outbound investment screening, this has been an area that Congress has been supportive of. I would say in Congress you've got a general view that we, the United States, need to be very wary of the challenges China poses, especially under President Xi. But within that consensus, you do have a spectrum between those of us who believe in a managed competition approach and those who may be interested in changing the status quo. For example, with respect to Taiwan, where that's a very sensitive issue. So I would say within certain guardrails, there's a pretty large sweep of views. And just to go back to the area we were talking about, there are some that would essentially want to decouple our economy from China in a very big way, which I think is both unrealistic, but also would actually hurt the American people. And then we have another debate about this issue of restricting export of very high-end technologies to China, technologies that could be used in their defense, for defense systems.
If you could make one change in Congress to make it work a bit better for the American people, because again, your nuanced answer suggested that it's managed to play a constructive role in a number of issues, export controls, for example, but perhaps one could hope that Congress work even better. So if you could make one change, what would it be?
So that's a big question. Look, let me talk about a couple other things we've done, and then I'll get to something that's right front and center right now that we need to change. I would say if you look at the legislation that's passed the Congress, there have been many pieces of initiatives that have been positive. So I teamed up with Mitt Romney, for example, Senator Romney. We passed legislation to say that the United States, when we're operating in multilateral fora, we should not allow China to be designated as a developing country, right? We think that they're no longer a developing country. They should not get all the benefits that come along with that. I teamed up with Senator Toomey, who's no longer in the Senate, on the Hong Kong Accountability Act to try to make sure that we have more ways to target sanctions against those who are involved in cracking down on dissent and democracy in Hong Kong. So those are some examples. There are bigger issues. Now, I will say at this moment, for example, we have lots of ambassadors who have been nominated by the Biden administration, like scores of them, that are held up in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for, I think, entirely political purposes. And this really hurts us because we need everybody on the field around the world. We need our ambassadors and embassies, throughout the world to be able to represent the United States. China's diplomatic presence has grown greatly around the world. So it doesn't make sense for us to, tie our hands behind our backs. This is a self-implemented, a wound, an own goal.
Thank you. So thinking about Taiwan, which has come up a little bit in our conversation, obviously the U.S. has a history and a relationship with the people of Taiwan and has espoused a one-China policy. There are questions that are looming about the security of Taiwan, about what will happen on the Taiwan Strait and on what time frame, about what the right strategic approach for the U.S. is to take account of all the complexities there, including its own longstanding interests. So say a bit about what the U.S. can or should do to be in the best position possible to handle this issue.
Sure. I do think this is an area where the Biden administration has done a good job. In fact, I think on overall China policy, they've done a good job. So specifically, we are underscoring the fact that we support the status quo in the Taiwan Straits. We don't want China to try to change that by force, and we're not seeking to change that status quo either. That means also making sure Taiwan has what it needs to defend itself so that they can deter Chinese aggression. We just saw after the new President Lai's speech, we saw a lot of very aggressive Chinese military exercises around Taiwan. So we want to make sure Taiwan has the means to defend itself, to become a porcupine. And again, on a bipartisan basis in Congress, we provided some additional funding as part of the national security bill that was passed earlier this year to provide military financing. We need to make sure Taiwan gets the weapons it needs to defend itself. We have a big pipeline of orders that we have to clear. So these are some of the things that we need to do in Taiwan. But I will say this, it's very important from my perspective that the world see that it's the United States and our allies who support the status quo, that we're not trying to upset the status quo because I think that would both hurt our interests, Taiwan's interests, and the interests of our allies in the region. The other big part on Taiwan, of course, is we have been working hard to strengthen our partnerships and alliances, not just for Taiwan, but for the region. As you know, the Philippines, has seen a lot of incursions by Chinese ships in the second Thomas Shoal. And so maritime security, protecting EEZs, working with our Japanese and South Korean partners, the AUKUS arrangements. These are just this is some of the architecture we want to fill out to make sure that we have a good deterrence in the region.
And what message does one hope that the Chinese leadership will sort of glean from all of these things together? Sort of the U.S. approach to the second Thomas Shoal issue with the Philippines, strengthening its role in the ASEAN region more generally, the efforts to increase rapprochement between South Korea and Japan, AUKUS.
So the message we want to send, and I hope that we'll be sending, is that, again, these are steps we're taking to preserve the status quo, right? This is why it's so important to emphasize that at the beginning. We're not trying to, encircle China. We're not trying to pose a threat to China in any way, but we do want it to be clear that trying to change the status quo in Taiwan through aggression is not acceptable. And the idea there is by creating this architecture that we will better persuade and send a signal to China that we support a free and open Pacific, and we want them to play by the rules when it comes to EE zones, economic zones, and maritime, the rights of these other nations.
So another complex issue that sounds in the key of security has to do with nuclear policy. And as you know, for many years, China had a stockpile of nuclear weapons that was not meant to be on par with, say, what the US had or what the Russians had. But Chinese policy is changing, and we've gone already from about 200 nuclear warheads to many more, and China seems to be on a path to producing a couple hundred more, with no clear indication that that's sort of the end of the process. That's already created some complexities around how to think about arms control, where previously, however imperfect that process was, there were two giants that would engage in discussions, Russia and the United States, and sometimes their tensions in other areas would get in the way of that dialogue, sometimes they wouldn't. But this is now a different conversation about arms control, also raises some interesting questions for Congress and the American people, the executive branch, about where nuclear strategies go for the US, What are your thoughts about where we are, what the key considerations are, and where you'd want us to end up?
Sure. Well, back in the day before I got involved in elective office, my focus was on exactly this issue. I used to be a staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
This is why you're a good boss.
What was the yeah? We worked on the INF treaty at the time, some of the START treaties. So, as you say, we have a long history. We had a long history of arms control, nuclear arms control with the Soviet Union. We do have the New START agreement with the Russians. Of course, Putin's, backed out of current negotiations on renewal there since the war in Ukraine. He launched the war against Ukraine. And now we have this other factor, right? As you say, China's, growing nuclear arsenal. They have taken the position, China, that, we're not really willing to talk with you about this right now because you, the United States, are so far ahead of us. I do think that we should press to include this more in our discussion. Interestingly, as you know, the Chinese have adopted a no first use policy. I actually support a no first use policy. So my view would be we should creatively think about how we can engage China on that question. It would be a huge mistake for us and for China to get in a big arms race in the region. And so I do think this is an area where we need to push them hard to include this in the discussion and where we should be creative about providing openings.
And this is not purely a China issue, but I just want to play out a little bit more the strategic complexities of dealing with a major power that is arming itself further on the nuclear front. There's North Korea, there's also India, which is nuclear armed, Pakistan, of course. How do you think a little bit about how the U.S. should approach this whole set of interlocking security questions that, we now talk about the Indo-Pacific, that play out, that include China as one potential source of certain pressures that the U.S. is concerned about, but potentially also as a key player in a set of discussions that touch on North Korea, for example?
Sure, and as you know, this was we'd made considerable progress with China and their position on North Korea's nuclear program many years ago, in the sense that they were working with us to try to restrain that. They don't have an interest either in North Korea having a big nuclear program, but that has fallen off a little bit in terms of our mutual efforts. I do think, China, being a nuclear power, has an interest in working with us to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons and weapons technologies. And their government has been, I think, has agreed with us on this. We have some concerns about some of the other entities in China engaged in nuclear weapons technology transfers. So we need to, this is another area, if you go back to the areas of cooperation, it seems to me, when it comes to both nuclear non-proliferation, but also a mutual interest in trying to rein in North Korea's nuclear program. Those are areas where we should resume more of a dialogue.
The North Korea program highlights the dynamics of proliferation and how technology spreads. A major driver of policymaking in the U.S.-China relationship now is how the U.S. thinks about its own technological capabilities, where those capabilities are perfectly fine to share, where they're not. The language of high fences and small yards comes to mind. So as we think about the most advanced semiconductors and the most advanced forms of AI and other dual-use technologies, how well do you think this high fences, small yards concept has worked?
Well, there are two issues. Number one, I do support the concept. It is not easy to implement. I think we should recognize that, but that does not mean it's not worth making the effort, because I do think it's in our interest to prevent China from getting the highest end technologies that they could use for military purposes, which is why I've supported as you just described it, the small garden, high walls approach. Of course, it gets back to your earlier questions on sort of de-risking, where do you draw those lines? How do you implement it? But I do think when it comes to very high-end computer chips and the manufacturing equipment for that, we have this, we're working right now, as you know, we've been doing it for well over a year with ASML, which is a Dutch company that makes these machines that help design the highest end computer chips, and Tokyo Electric and US companies. I do think this is worthwhile. Now, it only works, of course, if it's not just the United States that's restricting the sales of these high-end technologies, it's these other countries, whether it's companies in the Netherlands, Japan. So it does require multilateral coordination, as of course does this whole idea of restricting certain kinds of outbound investment in very high-tech sectors in China. Again, it's one thing to constrain American investment, but if some of our European or other partners are still investing in high-end technologies in China, we've kind of defeated the purpose of the exercise. So this requires a lot of coordination. We have a lot of good G7 statements, but converting a G7 statement into practical policy is the challenge. But it is hard, but I don't think the fact that it's hard should discourage us from making the effort to do it.
I take your point, and it sounds like when you say it's hard, you mean both making sure that one picks carefully and doesn't have the garden, by the way, garden sounds much better than yard from my perspective, is not too big, but also I gather you mean making sure that the right partners come about, that if you have a strategy that is really only a US-focused one, doesn't bring in the Netherlands or Japan or South Korea, it doesn't work. There's another way, though, in which it's hard, which I want to just press you on,
Sure.
because some of the perhaps critics of the small garden, high fence approach might bring this up. They might point out that when countries want to develop their own indigenous capabilities, they do import substitution. They basically stop importing certain things, build up their domestic industry, and that in some ways, elements of our strategy here, maybe not the restrictions on outbound investment, so that's an important point, but some elements almost work like a forced import substitution for China, and that over time, and we can argue about how long it will be, China will develop a set of capabilities that will make the US increasingly less relevant to its high-end dual-use applications. I just wonder how you think about that piece of the puzzle.
So I would say this, I think China is pursuing those goals anyway, okay? I mean, you know, they have the Made in China 2025 strategy. They've been very clear. They want to be the global leader in high-end computer chips. And so the more they're able to get that, you know, technology directly from us, the more they can short circuit that efforts. Now, you know, the counter argument will be at least they're still dependent on us for doing that, but that suggests that they wouldn't continue to look for their own ways to develop them on their own. In fact, as you know, one of the challenges we've had in China with a lot of American companies in the past is that China's require them to turn over the keys, you know, to these technologies at the same time. Because their goal is to dominate in these areas. So I don't think we should be any under illusions. You know, I'm not saying the United States should go for the sort of the economic model of China, which is a very centralized economy. They're a mercantilist country, right? They go out and get the critical minerals they need. They process them in China. But we should have some elements of what's called the industrial policy, right? I do think that's important because otherwise China will use these unfair trading advantages and economic advantages to squeeze the United States out and to squeeze American important industries out. I mean, we've seen that. I mean, we've seen what's happened over a period of time where we have lost jobs in the United States to China. And so I think especially in these critical areas, we need to have our own strong supply chains, and we shouldn't be providing China with an extra advantage. Not to say they wouldn't catch up, but that takes time. It also takes investment, and if you put investment screens on, you also can at least delay those. And as you know, when you're talking about AI, when you're talking about quantum computing, delay matters in the international market. So why take away our advantage, especially in these high-end areas that could be of military use?
Thank you. We have a question from the audience here, which is about the U.S.-European relationship and how it relates to China. And obviously, apropos of some of the economic moves the U.S. has made in the last couple of years, there's not always complete harmony between our EU friends and the U.S. on issues involving, carbon border adjustments and industrial policy and so on. But when it comes to Europe's course with China and the Europe-China relationship, what expectations should the U.S. have of European partners that are both aligned with U.S. interests but also realistic?
Sure. Well, let me first say I think that China's support for Putin's attack on Ukraine has gotten the attention of our European partners on some of these issues relating to China. And when China says it has a no limits, friendship policy with Putin and Russia, that also helps get the attention of some of our European partners who might not previously had fully engaged with us on this. Now, we're still not on the same page with all of them, but if you look at what Europe's doing, they have developed their own sort of inbound CFIUS rules. They are working with us now on some of these export controls of very high-end sensitive items. Yes, there are differences, and there continue to be differences within the EU. But again, I think this goes in the category of just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. You're asking a question I ask the Biden administration witnesses every time they come before the banking and.
Then it must be a good question.
It's a good, yeah. Which is okay. This is a good idea, but it only works if we can do it in coordination with others. It doesn't do any good if we say, this U.S. company is not going to send a high-end chip to China if the Netherlands or somebody else does, for example. So it is hard. It has the potential consequences you described, but I do think we're working with China, with our European allies. Look, we had this during the earlier administration. There was a big push on Huawei. It's actually an area I agreed with the previous administration about Huawei and ZTE, and the risks that those systems posed to our allies and other countries around the world. And so we've, again, it's a messy world. Nothing's easy, but we've done a pretty good job of trying to slow the deployment of Huawei in certainly parts of Europe. Now, other parts of the world, we haven't been quite as successful.
We have time for just a last question. What I want to share with you as a question is a recognition of something that I think is a theme that runs through all your comments today, which is that the U.S.-China relationship is important enough that it deserves the highest level of attention and strategic thought. Yes. That sometimes reflects a recognition that China will not see eye to eye with the U.S., and that thoughtful approaches to dealing with those risks are critical, but also a sense that there is an interdependence that partly comes from the economy, but also from just the fact that we share a planet called planet Earth, yes. And even if we have different values. So building on that, it is not lost on the audience that we're just a few weeks away from an election, and that in many ways the U.S. is as divided as it's ever been. That may be a bit of an overstatement. We fought a civil war, of course, in some time back, but the U.S. is quite divided. There are tensions that reflect everything ranging from threats on public officials to just fundamental disagreements about what does it mean to be American, where's the U.S. going? And I want to just bring that frame in as you think about where and how we go with the U.S.-China relationship. How does this level of division, but at the same time perhaps institutions that still hold together that may not be quite as obvious to other countries watching us, how does that all cash out and end up affecting how we're perceived and where we go with a relationship like this?
Sure. Well, that is a big question. And I agree with the premise of your question, which is that we are in an incredibly politically polarized moment. I've been in Congress for some time now. There have been deep divisions the entire time, but I've never seen a moment like this where I would say the upcoming election, which I think is about 20 days away right now, is not only the most important election of my lifetime, but one of the most important elections in U.S. history. And this will not be the place to get into a full discussion of that, but I do think the future of our democracy is on the line, as well as our support for democracies around the world, as opposed to authoritarian governments around the world, and I think the character of our country is on the line. So there's no doubt that when we're more united at home, we are, I think, stronger. That doesn't mean that we don't disagree. We've always had vigorous disagreements and debates. But I do believe that when other countries are looking at the United States and they see this kind of very, very sort of poisonous division, at the very least, it allows, China and others to say, look, that model's not working as well. You should try our more authoritarian model. So I hope we will be able to find a way to overcome these divisions in time. I will say that despite those, when it comes to the policy on China, as I said, while there's a spectrum of opinion, it's been, I think, an area where there has been some degree of common ground. There are people, as I say, who want to be much more, belligerent. But I think everybody recognizes that this is an area we need to pay attention to very closely. But yes, I think we all worry about the risks to our democracy and how other countries might see that as a weakness of our system. I will say at the end, our system has withstood lots of strains over time, and I'm confident that we will again.
Thank you, Senator, for your thoughts, for your time, and for the work you do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Evan, can you hear me? Earth to Evan?
Hi, sorry.
Evan, if you can hear me, just give me a thumbs up. Cool. Would you mind just sound checking briefly, talking real quick?
Evan Medeiros, professor at Georgetown.
Perfect, that's enough.
Yep. Okay.
Cool. Keeping the camera off for now, but we will turn it on. You'll be able to see everyone once the event begins. Thank you very much.
I think it's cruel to have to watch ourselves.
That's right. All right, fantastic. Thanks to all of you who have stayed after Senator Van Hollen and Tino Cuéllar's fascinating discussion to listen to this expert panel in which we're going to be talking a little bit more directly about some of the work that we did in the edited volume that we are releasing today along with this event. I've got a copy of the volume right here. It's called U.S.-China Relations for the 2030s Toward a Realistic Scenario for Coexistence. It comes out of the fact that in the American Statecraft Program here at Carnegie, we're focused on developing strategies that will help America to navigate the turbulent waters of the mid-21st century, and obviously among some of the most important issues that we deal with, China looms very, very large. And the specific impetus for this volume is a realization that I had during my time in the government under both President Trump and President Biden. And this was the realization that the United States didn't seem to have in its China policy a very clear picture of where it wanted to head. And this was a little bit disturbing to me because a central tenet of strategy development is that it's really important when you're developing a strategy to have a picture. One of my hopes is that by providing a somewhat more positive scenario, or at least certain elements of it, each of the chapters provides a different sort of view on some important part of the relationship. By providing this vision, we can sort of help to avoid allowing those really negative scenarios that are out there being discussed, avoid allowing them become self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, obviously, as we make clear in the volume, and I think all the authors share this view, there are absolutely no guarantees that the United States and China will avoid the worst. And the volume that we have here is not predictive. We've been careful not to say that we are trying to predict the specific direction that U.S.-China relations would go. We're just discussing one of the directions that it could take. One of the things that said that I learned in working on this and thinking about it with my co-authors is that it's not impossible. In fact, it's actually maybe not as difficult as it seems from today's perspective that we might actually get to that scenario where there is coexistence between the United States and China, and U.S. core interests are still protected. And I'm not saying that it's easy, but just that it may not be quite as difficult when you think 10 years down the road as it seems from today's perspective. So in other words, while just like as Senator Van Hollen, I think, made clear in his comments earlier, we need to be clear-eyed about the current reality of the problems that we face in the U.S.-China relationship. We can also take some heart and not assume that the negative trends of the last decade are necessarily going to persist in the next decade. They might, but there's also scenarios in which they might not. And so my hope is that this work that we've done here will help to open up the policy imagination in Washington and in Beijing about what might be possible. Okay, so I have been especially pleased in the work that we've done over the course of the last year and a half to have such a fabulous group of scholars helping with this project. I've really learned an enormous amount about U.S.-China relations from them over the course of the last year and a half. The people who we have included in the volume represent a range of different disciplines and somewhat different perspectives on China. But all I think I can say share a common concern with the trajectory that the relationship has been headed and a desire to see it go in a better direction. And so I'm really pleased to be able to have 5 of the authors here with me today. And I'm going to ask each of them to start off by explaining in 2 minutes or so what they think the most important point that they tried to make in their chapter. And then we'll have a general discussion and also be interested in taking questions from the audience. So I'd like to start with my current and former colleague, Professor Evan Medeiros, who is the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies and the Kling Family Senior Fellow in U.S.-China Relations at Georgetown University. As I mentioned a second ago, he's also a non-resident senior fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He has a background both in academia but also in policy. He served for several years in the Obama administration White House as a director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and then also as the special assistant to President Obama and senior director for Asia. So Evan, we're thrilled to have you be able to join us here today from Santiago, I believe. You wrote a wonderful chapter that was really crucial in my thinking about how we ought to approach the project. Your chapter is called Scenarios for the U.S.-China Relationship, Reflections on Positive but Realistic Futures. Could you tell us a little bit about what you think, some of the most important points that you would want people to take away from that?
Thank you, Chris. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this important volume. I think this is path-breaking in many ways, and I'm glad, very, very excited to have been a part of it, because I think it puts boundaries around the conversation in the United States about the future of the relationship. And the core point that I hope people take away from my chapter is that the future of the relationship is as consequential as it is uncertain. A trajectory toward conflict in the relationship is neither inevitable nor is that trajectory immutable. And my chapter tries to lay out what the range of possibilities are. And I do that by beginning to identify what I consider to be sort of the control panel for the U.S.-China relationship. The metaphor that I like to put forward is you're sitting in front of a control panel with a series of knobs. And these knobs have different values. And as the values shift over time, that will influence the trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship, being both positive and negative. And so the chapter starts by sketching out what these knobs will look like on this proverbial spaceship of U.S.-China futures. And so I look at issues like the sources of competition, the channels of communication, the areas of bilateral cooperation. Are they narrow or broad? What are the sources of ballast or stability in the relationship? What are the domestic politics in both countries? Do the domestic politics actually allow the creation or the formation of a political consensus in both countries for managing the U.S.-China relationship? Where are our allies and partners? Are they supporting us? Or are they sort of encouraging us to tap the brakes on more competitive strategies? And then, of course, you have to put the U.S.-China relationship in a geopolitical context. So those are the 7 variables I look at, and depending on what value you set on those knobs on your control panel, it generates different scenarios. From the positive side or the positive end of the trajectory, a U.S.-China condominium, all the way through to a 5th scenario, which I call a new and occasionally hot war. So there's a range of different options there. Readers can take a look and see which one they think is the most likely. But again, nothing's inevitable, nothing's immutable, and trying to think through how the values of the variables that I talked about, how they will change over time, and what that means for the relationship, I think is the right framework, and that puts boundaries around what the trajectory might look like. Over to you, Chris.
I think, Evan, that's fantastic. And one of the things that I really liked about your chapter and learned from our conversations is the extent to which, the future is actually more open than we may feel like it is, right, sitting here in Washington, D.C. today with the experiences that we've had, very trying experiences of the last 5 years or so in the U.S.-China relationship. Doesn't mean that things are going to get better, as I said a couple of minutes ago. But when you think, especially out 10 years from now, with those different variables that you identify, the range of scenarios is actually fairly broad, and I think that's a good starting point for thinking about the development of strategy. So I'm really appreciative of you for that contribution. Let me turn to you, John. This question of uncertainty is one that's important also, but let me first introduce you. John is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council. He has spent a large portion of his career as a CIA senior intelligence officer working on East Asian affairs, including security, economic, and foreign policy issues. He was a colleague of mine for a little while on the National Intelligence Council, where he served as the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia from 2015 to 2018, and in that capacity drove some really important intelligence community work that supported the development of high-level policy on East Asia issues. John's chapter is called Envisioning Positive U.S.-China Relations for the 2030s. John, would you talk just for a couple of minutes to, what do you think, it's a fascinating chapter, what do you think are some of the key things that people ought to take away from your thinking in that piece?
Well, thank you. As you might recall, I sort of had a hard time accepting the assignment. But just underscores the need for essays like these that actually envision the possibility of peaceful coexistence. I think we all kind of subconsciously map to the old Cold War. And partly because I think as Americans primarily, we feel comfortable with that framing. After all, we won that Cold War. We also forget, though, that as far as China was concerned, it also won the Cold War because it was on the winning side, not the side of the Soviet Union. So I actually then turned that to my advantage to sort of walk through some of that mapping and make a case, I hope, that the things that are currently lacking in U.S.-China relations that would have to exist for this peaceful coexistence to be possible would be that both sides would have to agree on what things are out of bounds, like regime change by either against the other side, some aspects of military buildup, or especially in the nuclear realm. I think that overall a consensus would have to shift from war preparation to war prevention. I then note that that really happened in the good old Cold War only after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But even in that case, we wouldn't learn for 30 years just how close we actually came to annihilation. And all of this was sort of interesting in the context of China until the Department of Defense revealed in 2021 that China is now massively increasing its nuclear forces. They're going to build it up fivefold, terminating, as far as DoD can tell us for now, I think their next report is due out shortly, at around 1,500 nuclear warheads and sizable ICBM force, most of which is directed at the United States. So it's going from, in the mid-2010s, having the smallest nuclear force of any of the UN Perm 5 members to having the third largest in the world. And we don't know where they're going to stop. It's also troubling because, not to overdwell on this, but DoD informed the world that China's doing this. The Chinese have not acknowledged it, and indeed about 3 weeks ago reiterated their commitment to no first use. That's not reassuring because the force they used to have was consistent with that. It was a minimum credible retaliatory force. The force they're building is not consistent with no first use or no launch on warning or no more aggressive theories of nuclear deterrence, especially combined with the realms of deterrence in cyber and space. And finally, all that adds up to avoiding an existential race to the bottom. I think right now we're kind of posed for racing. I think, for example, the most natural response to a Chinese nuclear buildup and aggressive Russian nuclear posturing would be to, and it's already happening on the Hill, large increases in US nuclear forces. And part of this is because arms control has really been decaying globally. Between the two former superpowers, Russia and the United States, were both U.S., I'm not counting us as former, just to be clear. But, you know, a lot of them are no longer in force, and even the current restrictions on strategic arms, the New START Treaty has got a termination date of February of 2026. And Russia right now doesn't seem interested in renegotiating an extension of that treaty. What I then kind of walk through are sort of things that, you know, I think characterize the regime today, because I think in order to understand kind of how we got on this perhaps dark trajectory is to really look at, you know, that history, how we got here, how China views us, how we view China. We have these kind of complementary dark narratives of each other, which is essential for kind of Cold Warring. So with Chris's help, though, I worked my way through all of this, I hope. And it got to the point where, you know, again, as Evan said, and by the way, I found his essay remarkably helpful in conceptualizing mine, that the future is not written. You know, China's changed tremendously at various points over the last 40 years. It's not inevitable that Xi Jinping's China is the forever China. There will always be increasingly authoritarian, you know, more authoritarian today than it was a decade ago, and that will be committed to this kind of racing. If we can work through those mechanisms that can provide a path toward peaceful coexistence.
I think it's fantastic, and you know, I learned a lot from reading your chapter, and I was actually enjoyed the process of working through it with you, and getting to that point where we both said, yeah, we agree that the future is not written, despite all of the bad things, which you openly acknowledge with very clear eyes, I think, in your chapter that are happening today. I might want to come back to you a little bit more on war preparation versus war prevention, but let me move to you, George. George Perkovich, my colleague here, who is the Japan chair for a world without nuclear weapons and the vice president for studies, again, here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is a leading expert on nuclear strategy and non-proliferation issues, as well as cyber conflict and new approaches to international public-private management of strategic technologies. George, also thrilled to have you make a contribution to this work. Your work obviously focuses on the nuclear dimension. Would you just sort of brief a little bit on what you think the key points that you make in your chapter are?
I'd pick up right from where John left off, which I think was a really good description of what's alarming now, especially in the nuclear competition. And it is basically an arms race. It's a three-way arms race with Russia, China, and the US, with no formal restraints once the New START Treaty ends. And that arms race, by the way, affects then what India and Pakistan do, because India is very worried about China and needs to balance China's power. China's trying to balance the US. And so it ties into the whole global nuclear order. Where I try to come in is to look at what could be alternatives to the worst case. John kind of laid out what is the current trajectory, which could move towards worst case because there are no formal restraints. Well, how might you affect that? Now, I would say the military-industrial complexes in both systems, as well as in Russia, like worst case. They help produce worst case. And so that's very hard for political leaders, especially in a democracy, to kind of push against that process. And I think there's another underlying driver that's problematic in both societies, is that if internally your politicians and others don't see the value of compromise, which is clearly the case in the US. So even within the Republican Party, they don't compromise. And then now there's not compromise between the parties to pass budgets and do things like that. It's that much harder to imagine a leader coming along and say, we can't compromise amongst ourselves, but we ought to compromise with China or the Iranians or some other evil actor. So it doesn't work. And autocrats also aren't very used to compromising. They kind of get there and they get their way. But to do the kind of restraint we need, ultimately you'd have to have the actors compromise and their political systems support that. And so that's a very tall challenge in the current moment. And so where I would begin is to say that you have to start with trying to understand the threat perceptions and the intentions of the other side. So John rightly pointed out, China is building up in a way. And we don't really credit how restrained they were for 60 years or 55 years. They were incredibly restrained, had a tiny nuclear arsenal compared to the US and the Soviet Union. And they would say, look, come down to our level. You guys should come down to our level. We totally ignored them about that. And they said, we have no first use. You should have no first use. We'd say, no serious country has no first use. And so then at some point, I don't find it surprising. They say, all right, we'll do what you do. Maybe you'll pay attention then. So they're building up. And guess what? We're paying attention. And so how do we unpack that with them? What are the threat perceptions that make them feel like they need this big ICBM force, and what would they do with it? What are our threat perceptions to convey to them? John made another important point on this. Regime change. Chinese leaders, like Russian leaders, like Iranian leaders, and like North Korean leaders believe that the US is about regime change. They may be paranoid, but that doesn't make them wrong or crazy. So how do you get at those threat perceptions and then find ways to mutually reassure each other that the worst actions we each expect aren't actually driving the process? That all seems obvious, but none of it's being done, really. And that was true in the Cold War with the Soviet Union until the 1960s and then the 70s. And so it's basic, and it's not being done by India and Pakistan. It's not being done by others, where you have leaders at the highest level communicating what their intentions, what their threat perceptions are, to begin to reverse the process and have restraint. And so I think that's going to be a key with China after the US election, whoever the president is to pick up where President Biden and President Xi left off at the very highest levels, to have these conversations about intentions and reassurance. There are a couple of things on the table. China has proposed talks on no first use. They've rejected US overtures for talks on strategic dialogue, but they've offered that. We have resisted it. I don't think that's right. We're never going to adopt the United States no first use, but why not say, why do you think that's so important? How do you reassure those who don't believe you, China, that that's your policy? As John mentioned, they're building up a force that doesn't look like it's so consistent. How is it consistent? Please tell me. We could have a similar conversation about regime change. You think we're about regime change? I don't know whether we are or not, but at least to have that conversation at a high level, how would we reassure you? Then the last concrete thing as an example I'd put out there is something the US and the Soviet Union did in 1972, which was an incidents at sea agreement. That both sides could agree that when their navies and their air forces or naval air forces were out exercising, boys were being boys and they'd fly too close to each other and they would do things to like scare and intimidate. And it was a great worry you could have an accident. And that an accident could create a nationalist demand that the leader make them pay, and you can get conflict out of that. It was precarious. And so they agreed on basically norms of operating forces at sea. And that helped kind of cool the competition and create more military-to-military dialogue and show that some kind of cooperation was possible. I think something like that ought to be on the agenda. Thanks.
Thank you, George. Audrey, I wonder if I could go to you next, in keeping with the order of the chapters in the volume itself. Audrey Wong is a Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and she focuses on China's foreign policy, its Asia-Pacific security issues, economic statecraft, and how authoritarian states like China use informational tools to alter public discourse and shape political process in democracies, what she terms informational statecraft. She's also an assistant professor of political science and international relations at the University of Southern California, and her contribution to our volume is called China's Economic and Informational Influence Activities. It's interesting, it gets to the question of again, how China, but also implicitly, I think to some degree, the United States are competing in the information space. I mean, Audrey, could you talk a little bit about what you think some of the main points that you want people to be aware of from your chapter actually are?
Absolutely. It's a privilege to be on this panel and to contribute to this volume. I do think, unfortunately, that sort of thinking about the domains, these are non-military domains, but I think domains that China is increasingly focusing on in the last few years, that the picture is somewhat less rosy just based on the trends and the trajectory that we're seeing. So, I think it's possible to manage it and we don't have to overreact, but I think this is sort of compared to maybe the military, the nuclear domain, sort of relatively uncharted territory, I think, in terms of the nature and extent of China's influence activities. And maybe sort of first briefly talking about the economic front, I do think sort of looking a lot of research that I've done on China's economic statecraft, I think, Beijing has often shot itself in the foot, because of the subversive and corrupt ways that is doing things. And so ultimately, a lot of the ways that China has tried to exert economic influence is really to drive wedges within countries and across countries, right? And so that's where I think China has been most effective. It's been really hard for the Chinese government to really, achieve, I think, long-term alignment, support, right, for the Chinese government and its sort of objectives globally as well as domestically, which is good because it means that the United States doesn't have to overreact. We don't have to, be worried about, everywhere that China has economic investment presence in. But I do think that one thing we should note is that China has been able to disrupt, sustainable coalitions, U.S.-led coalitions, China-skeptic coalitions, from sort of being coherent and sort of concerted over in the long term, right, in terms of, objecting or countering, coordinating actions against Chinese policies and Chinese interests. And I think the recent example where, Germany, a major, economy, right, has been a vocal sort of objector to, EU tariffs on Chinese EVs. And while that has gone through, I think it really symbolizes sort of the divides that China has been able to foster with its economic influence. And then talking briefly about the information front, I think we're seeing that China has increasingly adopting the Russia's disinformation playbook. We're seeing a lot of reports, right, about election interference. And one thing that the Chinese government is really keen to do, I think, is really to exploit wedge issues in the United States and other countries, sort of, exacerbating polarization, talking about issues of racism, of violence, right, as ways to, again, sort of sow chaos and discord and sort of delegitimize, I think, democracy for a public audience. We're also seeing sort of growing efforts at authoritarian transnational repression and efforts to control or shape the beliefs and behavior of Chinese diaspora communities abroad. Another, I think, important element to mention is sort of China's structural domination of the information environment on the global scale, especially, I think, in developing countries and in the global south. And that sort of includes sort of free content sharing agreements where, China is able to sort of provide its version of events at very low cost to, struggling media outlets in many countries, providing resources and training for local media outlets and journalists. And one thing I've noticed in my research is that a lot of this Chinese messaging and propaganda in the global south, right, really focuses on sort of less provocative wolf roar diplomacy, but not on wolf roar diplomacy, but on less provocative sort of propaganda that really touts the benefits of the Chinese model and how it provides performance outcomes, delivers economic development and growth, provides public goods for its citizens, right, as compared to sort of the contested or corrupt nature problems with elite capture in democracies, right? And so I think I've seen that really can have implications for public support for democracy in many of these countries. And so while I think disinformation is a problem in the US and elsewhere, I think its reach has been relatively limited. Some of these efforts have been relatively clumsy. And so I think we really do need to pay attention, right, not just to sort of Chinese efforts in the US, but also thinking about globally sort of its sort of more pro-regime, pro-China propaganda and how that affects general perceptions of China and the United States. And just a concluding point, I think it's hard to really change Chinese incentives and behavior in these spaces. And so it's really up to the United States to sort of focus on increasing the economic and informational resilience of itself at home, as well as of its allies and partners, right, by countering Chinese narratives, providing alternative viewpoints and information, right? So, this is not just sort of Voice of America approaches, but also, I think, providing resources and training, equipping local, media outlets in these countries, to report objectively and fairly and to have other sources of information apart from the Chinese government. And I think, within the US, we really want to raise awareness of Chinese and foreign influence, I think, at the local and state levels, not just at the national level. I think politicians are often unaware of, some of these potentially corrosive actions, or perhaps, less willing to know. So, not to conclude on a pessimistic note, but I think there are areas for concern that should feed into how we think about managing the relationship with China going forward.
Thanks, Audrey. I mean, I think one of the things in your chapter that I really provoked thinking for me is, well, first of all, obviously how corrosive this Chinese growing tendency to interfere in our domestic politics is, and it's something that we could continue, unfortunately, to see grow in the future. But given this, how important it is for us to figure out a way to avoid this, it's almost as if we need some way to have, to get China to make a credible commitment, or at least it may require both sides making a credible commitment not to interfere in each other's domestic affairs. I don't know how easy that would be, but certainly if it could help to stop the interference in our own politics, it seems like something that would be a step in the right direction from my perspective. Let me turn now, Stephen, to you. Stephen Wertheim is a senior fellow in the American Statecraft Program here at the Carnegie Endowment. He's a historian of U.S. foreign policy and analyzes contemporary problems in American strategy and diplomacy. He also teaches at Princeton currently and is the author of a book called Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, which has been much discussed around Washington. Stephen, of course, thrilled to have you involved in this project as well. You wrote on a theme, somewhat related to Audrey's, about domestic narratives in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's all this talk of a new China consensus in Washington, and I wanted to kind of analyze the conceptual contours of that. And I realized that actually there may be less to the new consensus than some think. So the United States had what I would call a conceptual framework for relations with China from the mid-1990s through the Obama administration, and that was engagement. And it was a conceptual framework because it provided an overarching logic to orient individual U.S. policies, and it was publicly articulated. It was articulated to the Chinese, and they received it in various ways. It was articulated in American domestic politics, and that mattered. And what I think has happened is the United States has developed a kind of bipartisan consensus against engagement for, I think, some good reasons. I don't think we should go back to engagement. I don't think we are going to go back to engagement, even if I thought that we would. But that's about as deep as it goes in a sense. We have not actually landed on a positive replacement for engagement that has the kinds of qualities that I just mentioned that engagement did as a conceptual framework. So I wanted to think through what are some distinct alternatives for post-engagement conceptual frameworks for orienting U.S. policy toward China that we might be able to select among and that we might see take root in 10 years' time. And so I used Evan's wonderful scenarios that start the volume and mapped on some of the options onto his scenarios that were based on conditions in the bilateral relationship. So to put this a little bit more provocatively than I do in the chapter itself, because I think I'm just trying to, as I'm sitting here on stage, I'm realizing what I was really trying to say. So right now, if there is a conceptual, the closest thing to a post-engagement conceptual framework that we have would be competition. Strategic competition under the Biden administration, great power competition under the Trump administration. Now, it's very plausible that that kind of framing will continue, But on a conceptual level, I kind of think it's going to give way one way or the other. It is quite question-begging, nebulous, and has a liminal quality. Over what are the United States and China competing? Are they competing according to a common set of rules? Are they competing over who gets to set the rules for the other to follow? Are they competing in a contest for power in which rule following is not even important? What is the end state that the United States wants to achieve for the bilateral relationship, et cetera? And the Biden administration has found itself trying to answer some of these questions in the domestic political sphere. So I tend to think that we might go in one direction or the other. So what are those directions? Well, one alternative, which is certainly not an engagement approach, would be an avowed Cold War kind of approach in which the United States would say what Beijing often alleges, that the United States is seeking the containment of Chinese power and influence in the world. That might sound appealing from the Cold War, and that's one of the reasons it has conceptual roots for Americans, although we should not forget that during the Cold War, containment was actually quite contested. It was, from almost the very beginning, seen as a dirty word by many critics who then pushed for rollback or even regime change, and indeed we now see those kinds of calls coming into prominent places in Washington with respect to China. So what's the alternative that would be in line with the spirit of this volume? It would be something that actually some scholars have talked about and it's present rhetorically in the Biden administration's own repertoire, which is coexistence, or perhaps even more realistically, competitive coexistence. That would be a distinct alternative from the old engagement approach, because the old engagement approach was premised on the idea that the United States and China were going to converge, namely China would become more like the United States, liberalized economically and politically. It would become a kind of junior partner to the United States in managing international problems, and China would not develop military power to challenge US positions around the world, including in the Western Pacific. Okay, those things aren't happening, and competitive coexistence would say, okay, yeah, that's true. We don't actually need China to liberalize, but we do need to place a premium on establishing mutual red lines, respecting each other's sense of their vital interests so that we will prevent a conflict. And so I think, we will probably move in one of these directions or the other in the next 10 years, although, of course, I'm not making a prediction as to which.
I mean, I think that's. I think you're actually getting to some of the issues I haven't talked about. My first chapter, and where I try to sort of bring some of the threads of the volume together. There's so many different interesting points that obviously I can't summarize them all in that chapter. But one of the core observations that I make is that in order to get to this kind of coexistence scenario, there needs to be an acceptance on both sides that the other side has, a legitimate right to exist and is legitimate as it exists today, despite the fact that we have conflicts, including conflicts of interest. And I think for the United States, what this means is, first of all, not hammering, not casting the leadership of China as illegitimate, even if we can be critical of their international behavior. And in general, accepting that the reality may be that China will have a greater role in international affairs, whether we like it or not. And the flip side of the coin is for Beijing to make a credible commitment to not attempting to overthrow the United States as a global leader, or not attempting to do away with the American, the international order that the United States has been central to, even if asking for certain potentially legitimate reforms to it. So I try to lay some of that out in the first chapter. We do have the possibility for a little bit of time for questions here. You have cards at your desk. If you want to submit a question, please do so, and I'll get it on my iPad here. Before I do that, I wanted to turn back to the panelists here and ask a sort of more present kind of question. We're looking at a scenario in 10 years where the United States and China are coexisting and America's vital interests are protected. Is there anything that occurred to you as you sort of thought about that the United States either ought to do now or ought not to do now that would increase the chances of that particular scenario emerging? George, I think in your piece, there are some actually specific things. Would you talk a little bit about things that the United States, you make some more concrete recommendations about things that the United States in its policy needs to accept or not do, depending upon how you look at it?
Well, I think there are some force issues, and I don't know where they'll go in the next administration that ought to be avoided, that will look provocative, but I don't know where those would go. So I think the most important things are, like I said, the as soon as possible direct engagement or offer of engagement for the heads of state to address some of these issues about fundamental intention and addressing China's buildup and the motivations behind it and what could be done to reassure each other. And that would involve, for example, the question at some point of missile defenses, and is the U.S. prepared to limit missile defenses in principle, or if it's an untouchable capacity. Because if it's an untouchable capacity, then people will draw, conclusions from that. So it's more at that level. And then I think going on what Stephen said too, how do we each address what is now a growing concern here and has been a long concern there about regime change and limiting the interference in internal affairs? It's getting under each side's skin. It's agitating, but it's not clear how you convince somebody that you know where the limit is. And I think that's going to be
need to try to put guardrails on that aspect of it. Obviously, it would be so important for the United States for the reasons that Audrey points out in her chapter. This is not great.
Right.
The trajectory is not good. Is not good for American democracy. Evan, what do you think about this question?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very important question, Chris. And in my chapter, what I argue sort of at the end is that there are two basic fundamental requirements for a sustainable interaction between the United States and China. Number one is working out some sort of strategic modus vivendi between the United States and China, which is sort of a collection of lots of things that we've talked about here. Whether it's about regime change or boundaries around competition or guardrails or whatever. There's got to be a combination of those in which leaders on both sides basically decide that the concept of strategic restraint, which, as John Retley pointed out, the US and the Soviets only adopted after the Cuban Missile Crisis, is an important component of managing the relationship. That's requirement number one. Requirement number two is you need to develop a domestic political consensus in the United States. And obviously doing one and two is going to be very, very hard to do them in tandem. So I think that our policymakers need to better articulate sort of what the goals or the end states are in our policy toward China, which I think should be much more about America and the world that we want than it should be about any particular decision we want China to make. And then we need to begin building a domestic political consensus around it. And that means that American policymakers are going to have to make some very, very hard decisions. Like, for example, what do U.S. policymakers think about the U.S.-China trade and investment relationship? The Biden administration has been very ambivalent about this. They haven't been willing to actually come out and say, yes, there are some sectors in which it's okay for American companies to do business in China, right? They're very, very ambivalent. So I think that, because of where we are in the relationship, because we're in the sort of early stages of this competition where we're just beginning to figure out the boundaries of the competition. Where are we going to compete and how are we going to compete? I think it's hard to articulate it, but I think policy going forward needs to keep in mind these two components. At some point, getting to a strategic modus vivendi, and maybe that can only happen after Xi Jinping. That's entirely possible. And thinking about building a domestic political consensus. And those two components will be essential to the kind of world we aspired to or the world that we envisioned in writing this volume. Over to you, Chris.
That's really interesting. Stephen, I wonder if you have a reaction to that. I mean, your chapter didn't exactly focus on this, but in thinking about the U.S. domestic narrative, what do you think we should or shouldn't do?
Well, my reaction is that Evan nailed it, so I'll add some footnotes.
Okay.
I do think one thing in our domestic narrative of the relationship. Right now, the basic narrative, if you read the national security strategies from the Trump administration or the Biden administration, is basically the U.S. pursued engagement, China didn't deliver the things it was supposed to deliver, therefore we must now clamp down on China in ways X, Y, and Z. I think we have to be able to make room ourselves to be able to say, well, our expectations for China were not necessary for American national security, and they were perhaps naive, even belligerent sounding if you're telling another country you expect their regime to change, et cetera, even through soft means rather than hard ones. So we have to come to that kind of realization, not to blame ourselves for China's often bad conduct, right, in order to get out of this trap of just blaming China for everything as if they're totally unreasonable. So that's one thing I would say. Just on a couple issues, I mean, we do have to continue some of the progress that's been made bilaterally on the Taiwan issue. It is very tenuous, and the upcoming U.S. election has major implications, I think. But if we can get to a place where the reassurances coming from the United States are clear and consistent, and we have a little bit more trust in the way that China's reacting, that's a big one. The other thing is the war in Ukraine. So I'm not going to say that the following considerations ought to necessarily govern how we behave in this conflict. There are a lot of important considerations at play. But if the United States and China were able to play a constructive role together in helping to resolve the conflict and achieve a ceasefire, that would have a range of benefits for the United States and for the bilateral relationship. It would slow down the convergence of U.S. adversaries into the so-called axis of adversary, whatever they're called. Lots of different phrases. Thankfully, no one's quite figured out the phrase that everyone latches onto yet. But before we even get there, perhaps we can arrest that alignment from continuing further, and also come to see China in a bit of a more constructive light in terms of the role that it can play on the international stage. Again, not predicting that that's the way it will go, but if we see an opportunity, it would be wise to take it.
And I think it's really important to point to that potential geopolitical benefit. I mean, if we were able to get to a relationship of like the one that we envision in this report with China, it would really weaken Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Right. And I think that's because that grouping without China doesn't look at all the same. And so that's a potential benefit that should be make us more willing and more eager to achieve the kind of outcome that we describe here. Audrey, what do you think?
I think I would add. I think sort of that is. I agree with that, and I think I sort of wanted to add about sort of Evan's point on the domestic political consensus. I think that's not possible if China is actively involved in this or aligned with a lot of these authoritarian countries, and also this consensus is not possible if China continues to sort of actively operate on or try to shape political processes on U.S. soil, whether it's through direct repression of activists or through interference or trying to shape how local and state politicians think. And so I think, that is a crucial red line that the United States needs to draw, right? If we're going to say we're not going to advocate or, shoot for regime change in China, right, neither should the Chinese government actively try to interfere with legitimate democratic processes on U.S. soil. And I think that would be crucial for constructive and managed coexistence.
Yeah.
Good. John?
I was kind of thinking about what, if we had a gathering of Chinese counterparts who were asked to write something for Xi Jinping,
Right.
and just how interesting that would be. First of all, because they literally, especially if you're trying to make a point Xi Jinping will find acceptable, they literally would have to accept his framing, which is very Marxist-Leninist, very hard power-centric, a bit reductive. And in their view, China hasn't done really anything wrong. That the U.S. was always, the nature of the U.S. is hegemony. Its global ambition is to maintain primacy in every domain. Important for your essay is to note that, of course, the East is rising and the West is declining, and the world is undergoing changes unseen in a century. So with that, you got past the old man's filters, and he's finally paying attention to you. But you're trying to propose some, things that he would be willing to do or could conceive of that would move toward peaceful coexistence. And I think that in a way it's harder, because they still view themselves looking at this relationship through almost a defensive prism. But at the same time, they see weakness in some domains. For example, if we're competing with them militarily, we're doing a very poor job of it. We build some awesome platforms. We spend enormous money. I love the recent paper that Taylor Fravel was a co-author of on really getting to an apples-to-apples comparison of defense spending. And it did say that China probably spends around $417 billion in an apples-to-apples comparison. But by the same arithmetic, the US spends $1.3 trillion on defense, while our Navy is basically shrinking, that we have enormous procurement problems. And then the other thing that she would find interesting in one of our essays would be the fact that the US may have chosen China as the pacing threat and the strategic challenge, or whatever vocabulary you like, but superpowers don't get to pick where they get pulled into engagement, especially if they're still bent on primacy globally. So war in Israel, war in Ukraine, wherever the next crisis emerges, the US may want to stare at the China problem and focus policy and resources and public attention and wealth, but we don't always have the freedom not to choose, to have to deal with these other exigencies that arise. So I think part of our problem is, even if we come up with masterful blueprints and footsteps we can paint on the dance floor, that from Xi Jinping's perspective, from China's perspective, they seem, I think, a lot more willing than we are on the stage here and the other authors to believe that a kind of dive toward the bottom isn't baked in. If you look at what their conditions might be for returning to more stable engagement, there's sort of a hard list of asks. It would probably require a fundamental change in U.S. Taiwan policy. It probably would require a return to a less allied-centric posture, especially with regard to Japan. A lot of the things have been done over the last 8 years in response to the threat that we perceive from China, have really kind of changed pieces on the field. So that the things that they used to take as comfortable signs of American acceptance of the need for stable relationship really aren't there anymore. So some of those, if we're going to try, you'd have to get them to agree that they can't return to the past, but that there's a future. They would have enough of the conditions that reassure them on the things that they consider red line issues: primacy of the Communist Party, its legitimacy in the international system, Taiwan, and territorial integrity.
So that about finishes our allotted time for this. This has been a really useful discussion, and for our audience, I hope it's been a good introduction to what is in this volume that we've just released on U.S.-China relations for the 2030s. These are only 5 of the 10 authors that have made contributions to this. Please download the volume online. We would be very interested in feedback from folks who have been listening to this. And let me just say a final, hearty thanks to my colleagues here I really enjoyed working on this with you. It was really fun for me. I learned a lot, and I look forward to continuing it. So thanks to all of you for your hard work. And thank you to all of you for joining us today here in Washington and online at the Carnegie Endowment.
Thanks for your hard work.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.